Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of Global Ties Alabama, we welcome you to our Global Perspectives Institute. We're so delighted to be back with our institute. We paused for a couple of months as we moved our offices physically. And so I think everyone will accept the fact that we had to take a break. But now that we're back in person, we're so delighted. I'm especially pleased today because I'm having the opportunity to work with a long-term partner, Jeremy Tober, as well as meeting a new partner, Kevin Cassidy. Both of them are doing some phenomenal work globally, even though they may be located locally. And so we want to use the time that we have today to engage international partners, discussing local impacts. I have to really appreciate another one of our partners, Carlton McClellan. Carlton and I have been working together with our national Global Ties US organization, and his leadership allowed us to meet Kevin. And so we know that international partnerships, whether they are local or global, are incredibly important. I'm also delighted because I see so many of our board members on and our diplomatic corps members. And so I want to thank everyone for taking time out of their busy schedules. One of the things that is really in the forefront of our news today, many of us are concerned about what is going on in Afghanistan, and we've received so many calls, and just want to let you know that because we do work under the auspices of the U.S. Department of State, that they issued a brief statement this morning just to ensure that their partners know that they're looking into the plight of the Afghans with connections to the United States through their participation in exchange programs. This is incredibly important to us because we host so many global exchanges with many of them, including Afghan residents and leaders. And so they're concerned about the development work in other fields and seeking ways we can help in this rapidly changing environment. Obviously, there's a lot to report on. They're not prepared to issue a formal statement at this time, but we want you to know that if we've had any visitors throughout the United States through the International Visitor Leadership Program or many of the other exchanges, that we are taking seriously those relationships and trying to be as responsive to those relationships that have been built with our Afghan brothers and sisters over the years. I'm also very pleased that we have our moderator today who has become a distinguished member of Global Ties Alabama's Diplomatic Corps of Volunteers. When Michael Wells was first introduced to us by one of our former board members, we had no clue that he would become so active with us. He's moderated a number of our Global Ties and Global Perspective Institutes. I'm just hoping that I don't get an invoice from him for services since he is an attorney. What we love about Micah is that he's an international attorney who's practiced and lived in North America, Europe, Africa, the Middle East, and Asia. So almost every topic that we have through our Global Perspective Institutes, he has some direct knowledge and or experience working through that topic. We were surprised when we were doing human trafficking that was one that he could offer some very relevant experiences with. So we just want to thank Micah for taking the time to join us again today as our moderator. And I'll turn the program over to you, Micah.
Great. Jackie, thank you very, very much for that. And I wish all of our participants that are here, I wish you all a good day. And I'm happy that you're joining us today. Um, we have two wonderful, very impressive gentlemen here that are going to be speaking on two very important topics. One of the persons who will speak first will be Mr. Jeremy Tolbert, who serves as the Deputy National Outreach Director for the U.S. Global Leadership Coalition. The second person who will be joining us and speaking will be Mr. Kevin Cassidy. He is the President Director and Representative to Bretton Woods and the multilateral organizations. Kevin comes to us, well, I'm sorry, I'm going to start with Jeremy first, and then we'll turn it over to Kevin. Jeremy comes to USGLC from the U.S. Senate office from Senator Tim Scott. He's presently located in South Carolina. He's been with USGLC for 6 years. He is going to talk a little bit about the history of the organization and some of the present accomplishments and some of the things that they're working on, as well as the mission of the organization. So, Jeremy, please.
Thanks, Micah. I appreciate it. Honored to join you and everyone else on the call today. Let's just admit, in-person events are more fun, but this is a great alternative. So hopefully we'll be able to see each other in person after the pandemic subsides a bit more. Normally this time of year, we're on the road hosting meetings and events. So looking forward to getting back to that when it is safe to do so. Thankful to Global Ties Alabama. Jackie, thank you and your whole team for putting this forum on today. Have really appreciated your partnership over the years. Kevin, looking forward to learning from you. You're the real expert here with almost 4 decades of international development experience. Now, of course, with ILO. So I'm really looking forward to hearing from you and learning from you as well. Micah, appreciate you moderating too. Special shout out to the folks on the call who are a part of USGLC's Alabama Advisory Committee. I see John, Al, and some others. Great to see you all on the call today. I want to provide just a quick history and overview of the organization I represent, the U.S. Global Leadership Coalition, USGLC for short. And then we can hear from Kevin and the others and get into a conversation. So about 25 years ago, USGLC was formed. At that time in the 90s, when the world was turning inward. The Cold War was winding down. There was a sentiment that we don't really need the civilian tools of engagement of national power. There were large proposed cuts to the State Department, to USAID, the Peace Corps. Members of Congress would go on the House and Senate floor and throw their passports down or cut their passports up and say, we don't need to be engaged in the world stage. Let's focus inward here on America. That was obviously deeply concerning for many people, businesses, nonprofits, faith groups. So that's how USGLC was launched. We galvanized voices in support of development and diplomacy. Many Americans understood that it's really important for America to lead on the world stage, and they really understood the range of tools that we needed to utilize, including citizen diplomacy. We know this matters to our national security, our economics, our American values. So that's kind of how and when the coalition was formed. So over the last 25 or so years, we've built a movement. We're a big tent coalition. The Washington Post called us the Strange Bedfellows Coalition because we bring together so many diverse and different groups and organizations, which is something we're proud of. At the national level, we have a little more than 500 businesses and nonprofits involved with USGLC. That's everyone from Boeing, Bread for the World, CARE, Caterpillar, American Red Cross, Catholic Relief Services, World Vision, and a number of others. We have a bipartisan National Advisory Committee that's led by General Colin Powell. We have a National Security Advisory Committee of about 200 retired 3- and 4-star admirals and generals who know that development and diplomacy is a critical component of national security. Got about 30,000 veterans involved with us across the country, state advisory committees, including one here in Alabama. We've expanded over the years into all 50 states. We hope that we sort of look like America. We're business leaders and farmers and veterans, pastors, university presidents, students, a really unique, diverse, bipartisan group of folks. We build bipartisan support in Congress for international affairs programs. That's in-district meetings with members of Congress. It's congressional candidates to discuss with them and educate them on the importance of these issues before they hit Congress. Town hall events, statewide events, op-eds, that sort of thing. So we energize Americans to speak out and advocate for the small but mighty 1% of the federal budget that is the international affairs budget. Small piece of the pie, but is often the first on the chopping block. Over the years, the results really speak for themselves. We've had unprecedented bipartisan legislation passed in our space, whether it's women and girls to the Women's Economic Empowerment Act, to education legislation, and more recently, emergency supplemental funding for a comprehensive whole of government response to COVID-19. Over the last year, Congress has appropriated a total of $17.47 billion in emergency COVID funds for the State Department, USAID, includes our diplomatic programs, global health, international disaster assistance, and refugee assistance, economic and stability programs as well. Congress has also provided more than $4 billion in emergency resources, mainly to Gavi, the Vaccine Alliance, to support a global vaccine distribution, which we know is critical to combating COVID-19. Over the years, we've impacted members of Congress and congressional candidates. We've worked with members to support these issues. I think of retiring Senator Richard Shelby, who is largely supportive of international affairs programs. As an example, he voted in favor of PEPFAR reauthorization, which is a program that has helped save 17 million lives around the world from HIV/AIDS. Congresswoman Terry Sewell voted for the Global Fragility and Violence Reduction Act and is a co-sponsor of the Global Health Security Act. So we work with members on both sides of the aisle to pass really important legislation in this space. Even in really difficult circumstances and political environments, in recent years, we've stopped $54 billion in cuts to the international affairs budget. We've lifted up policy proposals like WGDP, which is the first ever whole of government effort to advance women's economic empowerment around the world, seeking to reach around 50 million women in the developing world by 2025. The COVID-19 pandemic has obviously been a challenge, but it's really important that our work go on. We are spending half of what we spent 40 years ago as a percentage of our GDP on international affairs programs. So we are certainly not at the levels we used to be, and obviously there are significant issues around the world. So where are we? What have we learned in recent years? On one hand, we've learned that we're more connected now more than ever. No disrespect, but the old adage of what happens in Vegas stays in Vegas doesn't apply to infectious diseases. What happens in a small, faraway village can spread throughout the world in about 36 hours. We've also seen an inward turn in recent years, a nationalist vibe here in the United States and many other countries. Unlike 25 years ago, this inward turn is not really unique, but is happening in many countries across the globe, which we know has consequences. While USGLC, we advocate for a strong American leadership role in the world, the international affairs budget, COVID-19 has really been top of mind for all of us. So I want to briefly touch on that. From our perspective, COVID has exposed the reality of just how high the stakes are. We see the COVID-related issues domestically here at home. It's the first day of public school for South Carolina students. I've seen a number of posts this morning on just apprehension and fear and masks, many problems and issues domestically, but there's really deep concern around the world as well. The Gates Foundation said that the pandemic has wiped out 25 years of vaccine progress in just 25 weeks last year alone. According to the UN, there's a dramatic worsening of world hunger in 2020. Much of that is because of COVID-19. The pandemic's impact has, we don't know what the full ramifications will be of COVID, obviously, because we're still in it. But a multi-agency report recently estimated that almost 1 billion people were undernourished last year. The list goes on, the challenges go on. One of USGLC's efforts over the last year and a half has been advocating for a global response to COVID. And how can we not have a global response to a global pandemic? Ebola was global, and that was in just 3 countries. It's the right thing to do. It's in our own self-interest. We know that disease knows no borders. And if we want to keep Americans safe in the long run, we've got to combat this globally. We've got some challenges. It's really hard to make the global local case, especially when there are many concerns domestically for the health and safety of our families and our children here at home. We've got domestic health and economic situations that we have to deal with. And we're still in a really hard political environment, which is unfortunate. I think it requires upping our game. The reality is, first, it's hard to capture attention on these issues. In addition to the domestic COVID pandemic, we've had a number of explosive events, from the murder of George Floyd, the 2020 election, to the events of January 6th. This is not a normal time to transform the political conversation. More challenges. The global stage is obviously chaotic and pretty complex. As John McCain would say, it's on fire. The Afghanistan situation we're seeing now unfolding, the rise of China around the world, and their tremendous amount of influence, climate issues, extreme weather events increasing, the list goes on. Third, there are questions about America's, our role and our role in the world. The world is asking, is America there? And let's face it, when we're not at the table, others fill that seat. Americans, when you look at polling, want our country to partner with others who advance the security, health, and stability of the world. So what are we going to do about it? Hopefully we'll get some more folks engaged in the organization after the call today. So thanks again for this opportunity. In the short term, we're going to advocate. We know that a global pandemic requires a global response and global resources. We're going to fight to make sure that those resources are there. We're engaging current and future policymakers. We're hosting town hall events and district meetings. Last year, we hosted more than 300 candidate meetings before those folks ran for or entered Congress in some cases. In the long term, we've got to really reinvigorate a new era of U.S. global engagement. Richard Haas, president of the Council of Foreign Relations, wrote in Foreign Affairs several years, I think it was about 8 months ago, that we took for granted that everyone gained from a liberal international order. We've got to reinvest in that storytelling, which we're going to do as an organization. The global pandemic couldn't be more clear that this is really kind of the ultimate kitchen table issue at this time. We've got to return to conversation with our fellow Americans. We've got to listen, not just talk. We've got to go to them and meet them where they're at. And that's not just the big cities in America, that's in the rural parts of this country. We've got to really engage Americans in a conversation of why diplomacy, development, humanitarian assistance, American aid matters to our security, stability, our overall economics, and of course, our health. We've partnered with mayors over the past few years. We've hosted events. We have also launched a campaign titled Foreign Aid, What's It Worth? To really help us tell that story. I think there's a lot that gives us hope. The next generation of leaders is really exciting. We have a next gen program where we're engaging the young professionals, and it's really awesome to see their enthusiasm and their commitment to these issues. Organizations like this one who are really serious about elevating and promoting the importance of our role in the world and Alabama's role in the world when it comes to global engagement. I won't go through all the stats on Alabama. I think everyone knows those and just how important international engagement is to the state. The number of exports, about 17 billion annually, 20% of the jobs tied to international trade. Y'all know those stats and figures more than anyone. But thanks again for this opportunity. I would love to engage some more folks after the call. If you're interested in becoming a part of us or want to be invited to our events, would love to engage with you that way. So thanks again.
Jeremy, excellent job. Thank you very much. That was so informative. And I'm sure once we finish, we're going to have many questions for you. But thank you very much for that wonderful update about you and the organization and the 360 view of how we stand globally. So thank you very much. Now I'd like to turn this over to Mr. Kevin Cassidy, who is the Director and Representative to Bretton Woods and the Multilateral Organization for the International Labor Organization Office of the US and Canada. Kevin comes to us with nearly 4 decades of international development experience, and he has, prior to his appointment, he served as the Senior Communications and Economic and Social Affairs Officer in the ILO Office for the United States. He's also worked at the United Nations. Mr. Cassidy, please, sir.
Mika, thank you very much for that introduction. Really a pleasure to be here today, and thank you for Global Ties Alabama for inviting me. If I speak a bit quickly, I apologize. I've got a lot to say. I'm very passionate about my organization. I'm still feeling only about 30 years old, but if I've been working for 37 years, I think I'm a wee bit older. But the International Labor Organization is actually one of the first multilateral organizations. It was established at the end of World War I through the Treaty of Versailles alongside the League of Nations, and we actually predated the League of Nations in their first conference. The ILO doesn't only represent the labor side. Labor is an economic term, but we represent the workers, the employers, and the government interests. So we are a convening body that brings together these tripartite groups, as we call them, to discuss the world of work. Our main priorities are, and it's in our constitution, is about social justice, which is equal treatment under the law, and decent work. And decent work is more than just a good job. It is a job that offers an opportunity for growth, for advancement, for you to apply your skills for a decent wage that is freely chosen. So it is the antithesis of what we see like human trafficking or forced labor around the world, which we actually have the largest program globally addressing those issues. The reason I'm so passionate about the ILO is that, work sits at the nexus between the economic and the social spheres. The pandemic has shown us that we really are social animals, that we need to be with people, we need to engage with people. And work brings us into contact with people that normally would not be in our sort of social spheres. So work is a very important place. So technically, we are an agency of the UN system. We are this tripartite group comprised of government, workers, and employers. We are a rights-based institution, which means that we have this normative role that the ILO is allowed to set international standards, conventions in the world of work. We have very robust research, statistical, and technical role. And directly or indirectly, we have influenced the legislation of all governments over the last 4 decades. But more importantly, the ILO is a major international economic actor. We advise governments and we have a place at major international meetings. We sit at the UN's General Assembly. We are have standing within the G20, the G7. So we help strengthen the global economy and promote rights at work, because when we were started, the capitalist system that we have today was one of many competing models. So the ILO helped build the rules of the road, not as international bureaucrats, but by convening the workers and employers and governments around the world to set those rules, whether it's on child labor, whether it's on women's work, whether it is on women in the workplace, which today we are trying to encourage more women in the workplace. It always hasn't been the case, but also to set the standards in international trade. And I'll speak a bit about that as we go along. The ILO also is one of the few organizations that have a supervisory mechanism. So it's not just setting up a convention or an international standard, but we also have a supervisory mechanism that keeps governments honest on that. So for example, when Venezuela had confiscated businesses many years ago, the ILO took the complaint from the businesses and actually ran with that. So we actually have a commission of inquiry with Venezuela to address that issue. The ILO's conventions are actually embedded within the labor provisions of the USMCA. I noticed that Alabama does a lot of trade with Canada and Mexico. We are now actually in a GM plant in Silao, Guanajuato in Mexico, looking at a vote on a collective bargaining agreement to make sure that it's free and fair and that it doesn't put an uneven or a disproportionate value on American products as compared to maybe lower priced countries as well. So we actually have an active role in the world today. So the ILO has been around for this 100 years. We sit at that international spot, but also maybe some of you might know the issue of Social Security. Social Security is a whole cloth idea of the ILO that Frances Perkins, the first female Secretary of Labor under the FDR administration, had seen at the ILO and brought to the US. It was negotiated. It's unfortunately underfunded today, but it is a lifeline. It is a support, it is a safety net that helps people from falling into poverty. It helps that automatic stabilizer in societies. The ILO's first convention was on hours of work. So we joke with the students and say that we have created the weekend, but the weekend didn't exist before, because when you didn't have rules, you worked until you did not work. So there was importance to have the rules of the road, or what I often refer to as the plumbing of the international system, that we are able to judiciously use resources. And in this case, it is about the labor, about the knowledge that people have that they bring to their jobs, and for a fair remuneration and payment, and those who are providing those jobs themselves through their investments and through their knowledge. The issue of maternity leave, this comes through the ILO in our first conference in 1919. Labor management relations, which we call social dialogue. Social in our vernacular just means the public. It is workers and employers speaking together. The ILO has also been awarded the Nobel Prize in 1969 for our work on social justice. And we continue to be the largest organization in the world dealing with the elimination of child labor and ending forced labor and human trafficking. So that's kind of in a nutshell who we are. What I'd like to talk about at the moment really is the situation that we find ourselves in today. Now, the labor markets before COVID weren't rosy either. I think what we forget is that there was almost 500 million people who had insufficient access to paid work. So many people were unable to find jobs even though they wanted jobs. So you had all these people sort of wanting to get into the labor market, could not get into the labor market, and then fell into informality. Informality means that you have no protection, that you have no guarantee of a regular job for yourself. So it puts people outside protection of the governmental norms. And also, if you're in the informal economy, you cannot apply for unemployment insurance, even if it exists in your country. So globally, we saw labor decline about 51% of the income from our labor. Capital, some of you may know Thomas Piketty's book, which talked about the rise of income from capital as compared to income from labor. And labor has been on the downslide for such a long time, which is why I think we need to strengthen the rights of people who are at work. And this also means the rights of businesses as well, too. And we do that through our dialogue. So what were the trends that we had seen in this, in the COVID-19 pandemic? COVID-19 has massively impacted the labor markets. It is the most severe crisis since the Great Depression, and far greater impact than the global financial crisis of 2009. In 2002, we had estimated that there were about what we call 8.8% of total working hours. So not everybody was working a full shift. Some people were losing their jobs and then shifted over to part-time work. This is the equivalent of 250 million jobs that were lost during COVID. So it has a massive impact on the world today. In addition to that, we also saw that 114 million jobs were just not there relative to 2019, because the economy started to shut down. Global supply chains were inward looking. There weren't the demand, the consumer demand wasn't there. People didn't have the disposable income. So we saw something in the order of 134 million jobs relatively lost from 2019 to 2021. So, but the real worrying part about that is that 71% of all the employment losses came about with inactivity. So if you are unemployed, it means you're still looking. If you're inactive, it means that you've totally given up on work. And 81 million people globally have just given up on work. This has meant that we have seen a loss of $3.7 trillion within the global economy. And this year alone, in the first 2 quarters, we have seen a loss of 1.3 trillion. So we are coming out on the other side. It is unfortunately this issue of how do we protect the health of people? How do we get vaccinations in people's arms? How do we put in precautions in order for that to happen? because when you shut down, the demand is just not there. So there are a lot of concerns that we are facing. So what has been for us the overview of the pandemic and the impact on the world of work? What we've seen is that young people have experienced an employment drop 2.5 times greater than their older counterparts. So younger people are not able to get their foot on the ladder of a career for themselves. And this puts them back at least a decade in their approach to the world of work. So they are not going to have the opportunities that many of us had had when we had first started. 90% of the women who had lost their jobs globally have left the workforce. This is because in large part that there is no childcare available, that people couldn't bring childcare in because they were worried about their children becoming infected. Also that childcare is very expensive, that many women in the developing world, developed world, sorry, can't afford to actually go to work and stay at and have somebody look after their child, because it's almost the same amount, certainly in the larger cities that we see in Europe and in Asia and in Latin America and in the Americas largely. Workers with higher skilled levels tend to do a bit better because they were less affected. You know, we could, as knowledge workers, as people in the innovation economy, we could work remotely. We could do this, you know, Zoom calls. But people who have to be bus drivers or sanitation workers or teachers or people stocking shelves in supermarkets, they had to be there. They are considered frontline workers. They're essential workers. I mean, even people in bike repair shops have been considered, you know, frontline workers because they had to be there because people weren't getting on buses. They needed to have other forms of transportation. So it's a very strange way in which those who are the least paid were the ones who would be considered the essential workers in a pandemic. So what do we have now? We have roughly 2 billion workers who are globally unemployed, who would have been in the formal economy, but are now in the informal economy. This is not paying into taxes. This is not giving the government's fiscal space in order to pay for social safety nets for their workers. So it means that there is a tightening of the belts. And at the time when people need it most, you know, the lack of this fiscal space means that people will not have access to healthcare, access to education, access to unemployment insurance or income support mechanisms as well too. The other element that we have seen is that medium and small and micro enterprises, which is the engine of growth in the world today, and certainly around the US, you know, small entrepreneurs are hiring at a greater rate than the bigger multinationals are, that they are 50% more likely to be affected by the crisis than larger counterparts. There are other impacts, such as global supply chains have been disrupted. For example, there was a story in the Wall Street Journal that talked about how the fast food restaurants couldn't get their little ketchup packages because they went to the big box stores and made the big bottles of ketchup because people were, you know, not going out to fast food places, so they were staying and dining at home. So you shift your supply chain. So all of this has been happening. Housing construction stalls, investment is not there. So what is the ILO doing in response? And I will close with this: is that the ILO is a policy institute which convenes all of the governments around the world, 187 governments with workers, employers, and government representatives. Our call to action is outlining a recovery, an economic and social recovery to the crisis, which is fully inclusive, sustainable, and resilient. We want to leave no one behind. We have to have a recovery for all. And this is taken on sort of 2 sets of agreed action. The first measure is looking at national governments, employers, trade unions, to achieve a job-rich recovery, which will strengthen the workers' social protection and sustainable enterprises. Enterprises need to have consistency when they start making decisions. The second set of actions are looking at covering international cooperation with multilateral institutions for a human-centered pandemic growth. This means inclusive economic growth. This means working for the protection of all workers, strengthening occupational safety and health. It looks at universal, what we call social protection, which is social safety nets. So this is access to unemployment protection, suitable financing for these systems, this fiscal space we've talked about, and enforcing the essential role of the public sector in a well-functioning economy. And then finally, dialogue between workers and employers to help implement better plans of recovery and policy. I spend my days in Washington meeting with people on Capitol Hill, speaking about the work that we do. We're not lobbyists. We are knowledge brokers. We have a big, robust research department. We've been looking at these issues for 100 years. We have a unique set of data that we can share with people. We have practical examples of what works maybe in Germany or in Namibia or in Kathmandu and Nepal as compared to other countries, and what policies work best in all of this. And I also work with the International Monetary Fund, with the World Bank, looking at their activities, how we're ensuring that that money, which is invested in development plans, goes for the people on the ground and doesn't go just outside to big international companies that are just flying in with a technology, but really investing. And the reason that this is important is that investing locally creates greater velocity of income in those areas. And this is the same whether it is in Alabama or whether it is in Cote d'Ivoire or any other country that you're in. By investing in the local infrastructure, by training people, by looking at the long term and the future of work, which is moving more towards the digital environment, we need to invest in those future for individuals, for those institutions, and for the development of what we call decent work. So I'm going to stop there. I apologize for the breathless narrative, but I have a lot to say on this matter. So thank you so much.
Kevin, thank you very much. Again, another dynamic presentation. Both you and Jeremy, you guys, I've heard a lot of speakers, but you gentlemen really are some of the best speakers that I've ever heard. Not only is your passion there, but also your breadth of knowledge. We definitely have got to hopefully have you back for an hour or more each individually. Before we open up the questions, I'd like to start with several questions myself. First of all, how do we engage, and this is to both of you, how do we engage your organizations, and who do we need to do to support both of your goals? Because each is for the betterment of us as citizens and also for the betterment of us as humanity. So Kevin first, and then Jeremy, I'll follow up with you.
Just unmuting the mic, it disappeared below the bottom. I think, you know, the issue with international organizations is that we work with governments and workers and employers. So if you are a representative of a business, they usually work through the United States Council for International Business, which is mostly the Fortune 500 companies who are investing overseas. So if in Alabama, when you're doing export, whether it is on transportation, whether it is on commodities such as paper or wood, and so you know, the interests of those companies are growth. They want to make sure that they're growing. They want to make sure that there are good markets for themselves, and that helps build the economy of Alabama. So businesses that are working through the U.S. Council for International Business, that's the way in which to ensure that the rights of businesses in Alabama are protected as well too. For the workers, we work through the AFL-CIO, which is the large sort of Uber trade union down in Washington that has many different unions that are part of that, SEIU and others that are a part of that. So following up on this is just to say that by supporting the local legislators in building back better and helping echo that message back to Washington, as Jeremy was saying earlier, you know, that the multilateral scene has taken a bit of a hit over the last few years. But it's important to say that as a healthy planet, whether that is looking at climate change, whether that's looking at economics, looking at social, or mega drivers such as the demographics or pathogens like COVID-19, because COVID-19 is never going to go away. It's always here with us. There'll be some other pathogen later on that will come along. So we have to look at these as global issues. So working through these institutions, ensuring that we as a government, and I was born and bred in Brooklyn, New York. You know, I spent a lot of time. I spent a lot of time in upstate New York on my grandfather who came from Ireland on his rural farm. But I see myself as a city kid. But I was always enamored by what the UN can achieve. And what you have to do is engage. And it's not to say we can't learn. If anybody who's driven on the roads in France or in Germany or in some other countries, they have some pretty good systems there. So we have things to learn from around the world. There are good policies that work. Why don't we keep people in jobs rather than having them become unemployed and then have to pay unemployment insurance? Because it's hard to rehire people, and people lose their kind of network of contacts and they lose their opportunity for growth. So all it is to say is that there are institutions, and it's a bit more difficult for an organization like mine, but support Jeremy's organization, because those organizations are fighting for the good work that we do writ large. We don't want to see forced labor. We don't want to see child labor around the world. That is not only an economic problem, but is also a moral imperative as well, too. So these are the kind of things that can be done.
Okay, thank you. Jeremy, we'd love to hear what you'd have to say, how we can support you and engage with your organization.
Yeah, certainly. Thanks, Micah. We would love to bring as many folks who would be willing into the fold of USGLC. We wouldn't ask for your money or a lot of your time, but we would ask for your voice. It's really important to reach out to members of Congress at throughout the year, but really at key times throughout the budget process to really share some of those local stories. We found over the years that when you bring it home and you make it as localized as possible, that is oftentimes the most impactful thing a member of Congress can hear. So if anyone would be interested in attending our future events, virtual or in person, meetings, candidate meetings, that sort of thing, would love to have you be a part of that. What else was I going to say? Yeah, so love to just to bring as many folks into the fold as possible. Alabama has obviously been a pretty influential state over the years with Senator Richard Shelby and his post on the Appropriations Committee and a Senate race coming up. So looking forward to some more congressional engagement and would love to have many of you come alongside us. So maybe Jackie can share my email address after the call, but would love to engage those of you who would be interested.
Jeremy, I've got one more quick question before I turn it back over to Jackie to end this. Funding. In a perfect world, how much more funding do you need from Congress in order to do what you need to do? You said it's always a shrinking pie. Do you need another 10%, 15%? Do we need to write our legislators and say, guys, we live in a global village, and we need more funds in order to make sure that what's going on around the world will also have an impact on us. Is it a funding initiative? And if so, what amount?
Yeah, for sure. So the funding, it does change from year to year. Obviously, this is the last year was a pandemic year. We put out a global needs assessment after we consulted with a number of other organizations to see what that exactly looked like. The House did approve the fiscal year 2022 State Foreign Operations Bill, which is the bill that the majority of the international affairs budget is in. That was a $62.2 billion for the State Department, USAID, other development agencies. And that was actually a 12% increase compared to last year's non-emergency enacted level. And slightly above the administration's fiscal 2022 year request. That made it to the Senate, was passed by the Senate. And I think the House comes back on the 23rd for the budget reconciliation process. So as far as, time frame, this year, things are not over, but this is a continual engagement process and continually letting members know the importance of these issues, not just during the budget season.
Great. Thank you very much. Again, gentlemen, you have been absolutely fantastic. I know I've learned a lot, and I'm sure our audience did. And we thank you very much for the time throughout your very busy schedules. Jeremy, stay safe. You tell me that there's a hurricane coming, so that's most important.
Tornado watch.
Right, right. So again, we've had two wonderful hosts here, or two wonderful guests here. Jeremy Tolbert, who's the Deputy National Outreach Director for the Eastern Region for the U.S. Global Leadership Coalition, the USGLC, and also Mr. Kevin Cassidy, the Director and Representative to Bretton Woods and Multilateral Organizations for the International Labor Organization, Office of U.S. and Canada. Gentlemen, thank you very much for this wonderful, very, very important and very informative dialogue that you've been able to share your knowledge with us. Ms. Shipe, I'll turn it back to you for closing remarks.
Thank you so much, Micah. And I echo our congrats to our panelists this afternoon. I know that Kevin shared so much information. My notes have completely passed through one page. I couldn't get it down quick enough, but I would ask Kevin if you would just please share with the group about your recent 2021 report. I think it's called the World Employment and Social Outlook Trends. I'm just going to take a little bit of leadership here and ask that we extend a couple minutes as you talk briefly about this report, because I suspect that's where a lot of the data that you shared with us would come from. You can unmute.
Yes, I'm more than happy. Did you want me to speak about that now? Or
Yes,
just
if you could highlight it, and then this way we'll send out the link to our attendees.
Right. I gave some of the overview. I think if I got into a little bit more of a deep dive on this, I may overwhelm. But just to show what we have, I'll give you 5 sort of takeaways from our analysis. Is that we have seen that there have been large reductions in labor incomes. Some countries are doing better than others. It really depends upon how the economy is structured. Our second takeaway on that is to say that young workers between the ages of 15 and 24 have experienced much larger decreases in what we call post-support labor income, meaning that the support during the COVID pandemic did not benefit younger workers in many ways, given the structure of those economies. The third takeaway is to say that in the COVID-19 crisis is having a disproportionate impact on the self-employed people. And again, we look at it globally. So for example, a very large gap in decline in Peru, 21 percentage points. Brazil and Vietnam, the gap was only 5 percentage points. Again, it looks at how the economy is structured. And a fourth takeaway, and I mentioned it a bit earlier, is to say women have tended to experience significant drops in employment and in post-support labor incomes. This is not true for all countries, but certainly Brazil, Peru, Italy, United States, Vietnam experience greater losses. And that workers in the low and medium skilled jobs have really suffered the most. These workers in high skilled occupations, as I mentioned, managers, professionals, technicians. We are able to do teleworking, which has been really the winner of COVID, if you can say there was a win. So technology platforms, online purchasing, all of that had increased while all the other categories had fallen in below where we were at the beginning of 2020. And then finally, to say that there are going to be further increases in sort of inequalities, depending on the type of losses that we see going forward and how we're investing. So for the ILO, we are encouraging a broad-based approach, accommodative macroeconomic fiscal policies, as we call it, the support to people who are out of work, retraining, upskilling of workers for that. I can send you a little bit of a crib sheet on all of the aspects of the new report. It's not all gloom and doom, but it does mean that legislators need to make investments. I think what we're going to be seeing now in infrastructure is always a very good way to generate jobs. It will generate jobs not just in the high skilled workers, but it will be on all the trades, which is great because that money stays in the economy and creates greater demand and greater velocity of income in those economies. So I think that we can see a better world on the outside, but it's going to take a whole of system approach to make this happen. So it's not just looking at financial investments, but investing in communities and investing in education, which is really going to be the trick to getting out of this pandemic, and also preparing for, unfortunately, what may be a natural disaster or another pandemic that may hit us. Because again, work is an essential part of our life. Over.
Kevin, thank you very much. And Carlton McClellan has put the link to that report in the chat. If anyone is interested, I know that we have college professors, we have community service leaders on this call. We have members of the business community, the veterans community. And so this information is incredibly important. And Jeremy has already challenged us to reach out through USGLC. Let's use the opportunity to voice our concerns to our elected officials as we go through this budget season at the congressional level. When they return from their break, let's make sure that we have communicated with our elected officials. And Jeremy, I'm so pleased to be a member of the advisory committee, as well as those Al Wood and John Hamilton who are on the call as well. And I just want to thank everyone for participating. We will have a follow-up session, and stay tuned. This is an important set of information that we need to be sharing with our communities on the whole. So thank you, and look forward to working with you all again. And I couldn't end without saying, to very seldom do I get to say anything to a fellow Brooklynite. So Kevin, thank you for being with us today. Have a great one, everyone.